Us, the podcast. I am your host, Ray Harkins, and I'm recording this at about 1 in the morning in my car as I'm driving home from a reunion show that I did with my old band, Taken. More on that in a minute. But the guest this week, holy shit, I don't even know where to begin, but I will begin with the name, Aaron Turner. He is the owner of Hyderhead Records, who has put out records by bands like Botch, Cave-In, like anything related to heavy music that is artistic, groundbreaking, other adjectives I can't come up with right now. Hyderhead Records had something to do with it. And on top of that, he also sang and played guitar in a band called ISIS. And yeah, more on that in a minute. I gotta get business out of the way first, then I can just go right into it. Propertyofzach.com, incredible site. I mean, I just can't say enough good things about them. You should be visiting them on the daily, if not twice a day, maybe 3 times a day. 4 is a little excessive, so keep it at 3. They're great partners. They post our show. We're proud to be teamed up with them, so continue to visit there if you haven't already. Drop some reviews on iTunes. Go there. You will be able to spend 2 seconds and give us a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star, whatever you feel the show's worth. Give that review. I appreciate it. I pay attention to the numbers, and I see, like, okay, where it's like 79, 80. I would love to see more, because the more that we get that, the more that our podcast has clout, credibility, whatever you like to call it. And I want that, because I want more people to listen to the show. And then secondly, you can also maybe drop an actual word review, like sentences and putting them together. Do that, and I will pay attention to it, and I will say thank you. Because there's legitimately been people I've, like, reached out and done research and, like, oh, that's that person. I think I'm friends with them on Facebook. Anyways. And then visit the website, 100wordspodcast.com. You can follow us on Twitter there, Instagram, whatever. There's a bunch of shit you can do there. But above all, I just try to share fun stuff that I trip on during the week that I'm like, you know what? You should pay attention to this. Usually it's like songs, movies, whatever. Funny YouTube clips. But usually they all have something to do with the artistic endeavors of creative people. Anyways, Aaron Turner. ISIS probably is one of my favorite bands of all time. I saw them, I was trying to count it in my head, and I will mention this at the beginning of the interview, where, I mean, I think I saw them, like, around 40-ish times. It's stupid. Like, and I always told myself when I went to go see them that if they were boring, that I would stop. But anyways, I go into that in the interview, but to say I was excited that Aaron wanted to do this interview is an understatement, and I tried not to get too fanboy on him and, you know, tried to maintain my composure and be cool about it, but it was hard, because I just respect his work that he's put in creatively so much, and, you know, that's hard to do for such a long period of time. So anyways, that's Aaron Turner. And the reason why I'm recording this as I'm driving is because I really want to conceptualize and just crystallize these thoughts that I have of the night that I just experienced, and basically how it directly connects to why I do this podcast and why I think music is so goddamn important. So, like I've mentioned before, and like I plugged, band did a reunion show. It was a benefit show. The show was incredible. We raised like $5,000 for this family, and that just feels great. Like, to be so, you know, outside of yourself and be like, all right, here this is. We're getting together, we're spending money, we're fucking printing shirts, we're doing all these things, all for one person. And it was incredible. It was an incredible feeling, and that was ultimately the most important thing of the night. There was obviously byproducts of that. And it blows my mind, because this band, Taken, was not, like, we're not big. Like, and when I say big, like, we hardly made an impact. People knew who we were, sort of, in Southern California, sort of in Canada, other random places. But it's the intensity in which people latch on to a certain band when they discover it, you know, whatever walk of their life, and recognize it as genuine and something that is meaningful to them, whatever they're taking out of it. And it's like, that's what I've always noticed about the people that have followed what Taken has done, where it's like, okay, they recognize that it's just fucking dudes, like, we're not there's no illusions of grandeur or the fact that we wanted to do this band for a living or whatever. Like, not like any of those things are bad necessarily, but we never were like that. And I would like to believe that we came from a very genuine place. In any event, the fact that people came, people cared, the show was very well attended, and just the amount of people that walk through your life when you do a show like this, it was just incredible. And to see people that, I met a year ago and see people that I've met 10 years ago, a word for it is overwhelming. It's really hard to not feel so fucking sappy and just nostalgic and like all these things that, people try to make sure that they don't overblow things. But I'm just so grateful. And like I said, this is like, I'm verging on cliches, but I'm just so thankful that I was able to trip across this music scene and that it's given me literally everything that I have in my life, from my wife to my job. Like, everything is all directly because I decided to pick up, a record and decided to dive into that world. And it blows my mind that it's been able to given me so much over such a long period of time. And so, yeah, whatever. This is basically a love letter to independent music. But I hope that you can sort of derive some meaning out of that, whether or not it's like, oh, this band, I totally get it. Like, this band has got me through the most difficult times in my life and is so meaningful to me. And if they ever did a reunion or they played around me or whatever, I would just, lose my shit. And I like the fact that people can be so passionate about it. So it's just awesome. And that's like why I love doing these interviews, because I try to get to the core of why people are doing what they do. And honestly, if you've listened to almost every episode, you'll notice a theme and a trend where it's like, people really do, even though they might be playing different music and be in so many different parts of their lives, that they all kind of have similar stories and they've all had similar experiences with music in general. It's just such a powerful medium, and like I couldn't even imagine my life not having that in it. So anyways, here's the interview I did with Aaron Turner, and the passion is just bleeding all over this. I can't even stop. It's fucking 1 a.m, and I'm going crazy. So anyways, here it is. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll talk to you after.
I think so, yeah.
I totally feel you on that, because it definitely affected my house as well. So,
yeah.
But yeah, this obviously I don't want this to be a very typical interview in the sense of question, answer. It's just very casual conversation. I'll just kind of walk you through your life, and essentially, what I like to derive from these is just kind of why people do what they do, and how. Okay. So and I mean it'll probably take somewhere 40-ish minutes or so. So but if I do hit on anything that you're like, yeah, I don't want to talk about that, that's totally fine. We can skip it. It's not a big deal.
I'm usually good at being pretty straightforward about that. That's a problem.
Yeah. No. No, I figured. I actually interviewed you. This was like eons and eons ago, but there's a terrible magazine from Southern California called Scratch, and
I remember that one.
Yeah, it was an awful magazine, but I just did freelance writing for anybody that I could, and so so usually I like to start things off with just like my own personal sort of experience, interaction just with the musical entity that you're most known for, which obviously is ISIS. I don't even know if I would say that anybody that labels themselves obviously like, oh dude, I'm a super fan of this band. Like, I feel it's pretty nerdy, and not in a good way. But because it's like, I literally cannot count how many times I saw you guys play, like and I think the first time I saw you was when you guys toured out west with Cave-In. And that
'99. So yeah, that was quite a while ago.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I it was one of those things that, like, I think what spoke to me about your band was just the fact that, like, I honestly always told myself, all right, dude, if they aren't that good live, or, like, you just don't feel excited to watch a band anymore, like, if you're just doing it out of repetition or nostalgia. Like,
Yeah.
and so I really did always gut check myself, where I was like, all right, dude, do I really need to see ISIS for, like, no joke, like the 42nd time? But then, I don't know, you guys just didn't bore me, which is, I guess, what any band could ask for.
Yeah, well, we did our best to not over tour. I think that was something we saw happen with friends of ours, or our people in our peer group, where either they or their audiences or both just got burned out from doing the same circuits over and over. And we did, we obviously ended up playing some places over and over again, but that was simply because we were just around long enough to make that happen.
Right.
Even at our highest peak of activity, we tried not to tour the U.S. more than once a year.
Right.
And in some cases, it was spread out even further, a bit further apart. So
what I always found about you guys too is, like, even if I did see you, touring, like, quote unquote, more frequently, like, if you were through the same spot within, whatever, a 6-month period, you were doing a tour that, like, you couldn't say no to. Like,
yeah.
If Mogwai is going to be like, hey, you guys, we're friends, how about you come out with us? It's not like you're going to be like, nah.
Yeah. Well, that was another exception too. I mean, for instance, if we, like you pointed out, had an opportunity to play somewhere opening for someone else, that would be a different set of circumstances, because I feel like in a lot of ways, playing to an audience like Mogwai or somebody, like Tool or whatever other bands that we opened for, whose audience would have been previously unaware of us, that would have been a wholly different set of people, which, for us, especially when we were still trying to expand the band in that way, was really important.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's yeah. So, anyways, I'm not trying to blow too much smoke up your ass, but just I watched you play probably way too many times than I probably should care to admit. But so good job. Way to not be boring after a while.
Yeah, that's good. Well, some of my favorite bands have become my favorite bands because they've been consistently good live, no matter how many times I've seen them, and there are not many that fall into that category, but I appreciate a lot the ones that do.
Yes, well, that's good. I'm glad. And so kind of going all the way back to the start, where were you born and raised? I mean, I know you spent time in Albuquerque. Is that correct?
Close, Santa Fe.
Oh.
I wasn't born there. I was born in Springfield, Massachusetts. But my family moved to New Mexico, I think, when I was 1.5, and even prior to that, they were spending the summers there. So I feel that's where I originate from, and that was where I grew up. And I didn't end up leaving there until I was 17, when I went to Boston to go to college.
Right. So yeah,
definitely all of my formative experiences were there. Exactly
right. The formative years, and it was funny because I was actually talking about New Mexico today to my wife, because we were I'm sure you're familiar with that show Breaking Bad.
Oh yeah.
And so, like, I've never had any I guess, like, just normal experiences in New Mexico in general. Just like Albuquerque is such a strange city, and like New Mexico is just this kind of, it's just a weird state. And I don't know if that was like something that you observed as you were kind of growing up, or was it just kind of, you were surrounded by it?
I was normalized for me because I grew up there, and I didn't really start to understand how unique it was until I left and started bringing other people back, or occasionally, people would come and visit me or my family before I moved away and would comment on how different it seemed. And I still can't see it from a completely outside perspective.
Right.
Like I said, it was normalized for me having grown up there, but it is a very unique place, and I in most ways, I feel fortunate for having grown up there, partially because of that, but for a variety of other reasons too.
Yeah. So what did your what did your parents do for a living? And do you have any brothers and sisters?
I'm the youngest of five.
Oh, wow.
I only grew up with one of my siblings. The others, they're half siblings, and they lived with their mother. But they came and stayed with us a lot, so they were in and out all the time when I was growing up. My dad is a writer, and my mother, for much of the time I was growing up, was involved in education.
I see. What, just like the educational system, or was she actually a teacher herself?
She was a teacher for a while, and then she was part of a nonprofit group that developed curriculum of different kinds, but largely centering around environmental issues for everywhere, age range from, elementary school all the way through high school. So that was a big part of her pursuits when I was growing up.
Sure. And what your dad was a writer. What was his focus?
He wrote a lot of nonfiction and did some journalism, pretty much up until the time I left for college, and then in subsequent years has been focusing a lot more just on fiction with occasional freelance articles.
Oh, interesting. Like, was it that seems like a job that would be, I wouldn't say difficult to explain, but you might have looked at your father and been kind of like, oh, like that's not like what everybody's dad does. Like, they're not a, banker or whatever the typical dad job was that, when you were going through elementary school and high school and stuff like that.
To some extent, but Santa Fe had a lot of writers and painters and photographers. I mean, in a certain way, there was a big arts community there.
That's true.
It wasn't necessarily very progressive, and a lot of it was very regionally specific in a certain way, but it was still, I think, more present there than a lot of other towns of that size.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of associations with it around that.
Yeah, no, that is true. I forgot. Yeah, in the context of Santa Fe, you definitely hear a lot of people that they go there to work on their craft because there might be less distractions in a way. Yeah. And so you as you kind of grew up in New Mexico, did you what did you find yourself doing? Were you into sports and or were you more of a indoor kid, as I like to refer to him to that too?
I wasn't an indoor kid, but I wasn't into sports either. But there was a lot to see and do in the natural landscape around where I grew up, and like a lot of kids, I just learned how to make my own fun running around outside. Mm-hmm. But I was pretty good at entertaining myself indoors as well. I was definitely really into drawing and listening to music, and later making music, to a slightly lesser extent reading, as I was growing up. So those were my main pursuits,
Sure.
Some of which were extremely introverted, but some of which later became group activities too. So I would definitely say that I was naturally drawn to creative pursuits from an early age. My parents definitely encouraged me that way too, and I ended up befriending a lot of people with similar interests.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask. Because sometimes, I mean, usually, when you're younger, obviously your parents tend to want to foster their children's curiosity, but then obviously sometimes there comes to a point where it's like, oh, like, it's either not economically viable to help them, along this path, or it's like, they're just, you kind of have to choose to do something else in a way. But it's great that they were obviously, understanding of what you started to get into.
Yeah, I think there were times, especially my dad didn't really understand it, and I won't say that he disapproved exactly, but I think it took him especially a long time to kind of realize that I was really serious about it, and that heavy metal wasn't just a passing interest or like a teenage phase.
Right.
But overall, I would say that growing up in a household with parents who liked it and loved a lot of music and were appreciative of the arts in general was probably really good for me.
Yeah. So like, was music important to them in the sense of like, they were exposing you to certain styles of music that they were into and stuff like that?
To some extent, I mean, it was sort of just partially by proximity. They didn't really try to get me into one thing in particular. It was just that they listened to a lot of music, so I heard it a lot.
Right.
And for a long time, I was really averse to the stuff they liked, partially just because I was a kid and I didn't want to like what my parents liked.
Right.
But nonetheless, the fact that they liked classical music and jazz and stuff that was a little more progressive in nature or not necessarily commercially oriented music, I think was an important thing for me in the formative way too.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, especially because usually most, people's experience, especially within this sort of independent, music culture is like, oh yeah, my parents were into the radio and that's kind of like, where it existed. Like very, very rare occasions where you actually get a person who is just like, oh yeah, my dad bought me, my first Kiss record. It's just like, well, that doesn't happen so much.
Yeah. Well, being the youngest of five, my dad was quite a bit older than the parents of a lot of my peers, so he was definitely too old to have hit like the what I guess when I was growing up would have been considered classic rock. I mean, he was a teenager long before any of that stuff happened. So
interesting.
I escaped that particular phenomenon, and that might be part of the reason why I still don't really care much for a lot of pop music.
Yeah, sure. Because you're like, well, my dad was listening to more highbrow music. It's like, yeah, I don't. This top 40 stuff doesn't really appeal to me.
Yeah.
And so that as you started to go through high school, I guess kind of a two-part question where the, what sort of role did you find yourself, filling at high school as far as, part of communities you were gravitating towards? And then I guess the second part was like, did you invest time in studies and did you kind of, dive into high school or was it more?
No,
so?
I was a terrible student.
Yeah.
I really was. I mean, as far as academic stuff goes, my art teachers loved me, and I was lucky in that way because I had one especially good one in my junior and senior year, and I did work hard at that, but I was not diligent with the rest of my homework, and my grades definitely reflected that.
Sure.
I think my last 2 years of high school were the most formative in terms of what I ended up doing. I befriended some other kids, the few kids that were in my high school who listened to punk and hardcore. And that was a huge turning point for me. Prior to that, I was definitely more into smoking pot and, listening to Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and just doing some sort of more average teenage things in a way. And
Sure.
I encountered these kids and got into being straight edge and veganism and some more, I guess, political ideals and listening to underground music, and that changed my life forever.
Right.
So we were definitely outsiders, and in a way there wasn't that many of us in our little group, and like a lot of kids, I think we were all searching for our own sense of identity, and that made us feel important and bonded together and helped us define who we were in the context of our larger peer group.
Right. I think you said something that totally triggered a memory for me where it was like the idea of the work that you were doing as far as like the music you were getting into and like you said, the political activism and whatever. Once your world started to become bigger, you felt like you were on a secret, like no one else around you knew about it. And you were just like, I'm into some awesome shit here. Like, how come you understand this?
Yeah. I think that was part of it. I mean, I think part of it was really resonating with me on a deep level, and part of it was just teen angst. Like I wanted to be different, or I wanted to piss people off, or I wanted to piss my parents off.
Right.
Certainly factors, but some of it really stuck with me, and I've carried it forward to this day. So there must have been something deeper there beyond just wanting to be different or to stir shit up.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I find it interesting too because I imagine you were going to high school like in the early 90s, I would say, or early to mid 90s.
Yeah, I graduated in 95.
Okay, yeah. So, the idea, especially, here we are in 2013, and the idea of like regional music scenes, it still exists, but it's obviously, Akron, Ohio can have just as vibrant of a music community as somewhere else because obviously the globalization of the internet. But
yeah,
the point I'm making where it's like Santa Fe, like I'd have a hard time thinking of one band that originated from there. So it's like the fact that you guys were, a niche of a niche and getting into stuff that wasn't coming through your town. Like, so were there a decent amount of shows that you guys were able to go to, or just here and there?
There are some local bands. Most of them were at that time just kind of like the alternative rock type of bands, like, influenced by, the grunge and pre-grunge explosion, but there was a very small group of punk bands too, mostly on the crustier end of the spectrum.
Got it.
And there was one in particular, this band Logical Nonsense, who did a couple records on Alternative Tentacles, and I think even to this day they're one of the few bands from New Mexico that kind of made it out into the wider world. I remember it was a huge deal when they got an opening spot for Neurosis on the Enemy of the Sun tour, and it was like it was kind of a feat for a local band to get something of that high profile, and of course them getting signed to Alternative Tentacles is a big deal too.
Yeah, no, I totally remember that band, and that was I had no sense of where they were from, but that's funny.
Yeah, but there wasn't much of a local scene to speak of. I mean, the times when Logical Nonsense did play, it was, at youth centers or somebody's basements. But around the time I got out of high school, there started to be a little bit more happening. There's definitely more going on in Albuquerque. National bands who did decide to stop in New Mexico often only played in Albuquerque, so we had to go down there and make the drive if we wanted to see that stuff.
Right.
But it was definitely, you kind of had to work for it, and the shows were definitely small. So yeah, it wasn't easy to get into that stuff, being where we were.
Right.
But,
it took.
I'm very grateful that I did.
Right. Yeah. It took a lot of heavy lifting. It was like, this isn't something that just drops in your lap. There's like, no, we gotta invest in this.
Yeah, and there was definitely no straight edge hardcore bands in New Mexico.
No,
none. Like, we were the only kids, I think, in the whole state who were into that stuff, with the exception of maybe a handful in Albuquerque.
Right? No. You definitely don't see Santa Fe straight edge varsity jackets at all.
No, definitely not.
That's incredible. The medium in which you were working in regards to art, like, is obviously, like you were saying, your junior, senior year. Everybody always has that one teacher in high school that is like of the subject that they enjoy, that totally ushers them through and is like, oh, this is what I want to try to do. And like, it sounds like you had that experience too.
Yeah, in some ways that teacher, he didn't necessarily save my high school career, but I did consider dropping out and just taking the GED test and going that route. And I don't know that it would have had a really detrimental impact on my future, but nonetheless, it was really good for me to encounter this particular teacher, and he encouraged me a lot and definitely got me to break out of my own way of doing things and showed me that there were a lot of other possibilities in terms of how I could pursue art and think about it.
Right.
So I think that was a very important turning point for me that occurred at the same time as my discovery of punk and hardcore.
Sure.
And it was also because of being in his class that I ended up meeting one of the representatives from the art school I ended up going to in Boston, which was another obviously big change for me that affected everything that happened thereafter.
Yeah, no, totally. And before we move on to that, what medium were you primarily concentrating on? Just mostly like drawing, like you were saying?
Drawing and painting, yeah.
Got it. So yeah, like you said, I mean, you moved to Boston to go to art school and everything, and so at this time, I'm sure the relationship between you and your parents was pretty strained, and I'm sure in some ways they were probably relieved that you had some sense of direction where it's like where you wanted to go. Was that the case, or was it they were just kind of like you're like I got to get out of here, and they were like go?
Again, I think my mom was always pretty supportive of whatever I wanted to do, and I don't know how much she ever worried about me in terms of my future.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my dad definitely wondered a lot more about what I was going to do.
Right.
I don't know if I've never really talked to him about it all that much, but I think I got the sense that he kind of assumed I was going to art school just because I didn't want to do regular schoolwork, which
Right.
was part of my motivation, but it was also because I really did want to try to pursue art in some more serious fashion. And it wasn't until my third or fourth year of school that he saw I was really seriously invested in having, creativity, whether in art or music,
Right.
both, at the center of my life. And I think he started to feel a little more relieved or assured that I wasn't just going to be directionless. And my veganism and being straight edge was off-putting for them and him in particular in a certain way, but I also think, especially for my mom, it was actually kind of reassuring. Like I knew I wasn't going to go off to college just to party, so that was probably helpful.
Yeah, right.
Helpful for me.
But I mean, it's interesting though, because like everything that you're talking about, your father, like you said, he's obviously older. And I mean, when it comes to that, parents wrapping their heads around what their kids are doing when it's out of context, it's like, they don't understand, like, whatever, whatever, 20, 30 years down the line, you have a child, it's like, they start to get into, something where you're just like, I have no idea what this is, like, but you may have a better, you may have a better sense of it now because you have experienced like, you've experienced a lot of subgenres and niches of interest, but yeah, it's like, so I'm sure you can totally understand where it's like, oh yeah, I can see where my dad was like, Aaron is fucking up, man. He is making some bad decisions here.
I'm like a lot of parents too. I think my dad, he viewed his life in some way as a series of bad mistakes and just didn't want me to make the same mistakes.
Sure. He's like, Aaron, use my life as a roadmap. Do not go down this path. That's funny.
Yeah.
And so then, I'm sure the move from New Mexico to Boston was just, was there a large adjustment, shall we say?
In a certain way, yeah. I mean, I was totally ready for it at that point. So there was nothing about moving to a big city that was off-putting to me. I was just excited about it, all across the board. So I didn't feel like overwhelmed. I just dropped into Boston and went for it, basically.
Right.
Because of the musical community that I was a part of, it was pretty easy for me to make connections, making friends, and start finding people to play music with. So that's another way in which being a part of the underground music scene was really helpful for me. I was making connections based off of a shared interest in being creative, rather than just wanting to party and fuck off, basically. So even though I probably spent a lot more time going to shows and assembling records in my bedroom than I did working on some of my schoolwork, I think it was still a very good place for me to be, and ultimately shaped my life in a very positive way.
Right. In looking at obviously what you've done throughout your life as well, it always struck me like, I definitely think that it's something within the DNA of people who, once they started getting into independent music, you can't simply just do one thing. Like, you're not just like, all right, I'm going to, play in a band or whatever. It's you're like, all right, I'm going to play in a band. I'm going to put on some shows. I want to put out some friends records. I want to do like, there's always like 5 million things that you want to do. Obviously part of it is youth because you're excited, but it's always struck me that it comes from the fact that you obviously want to create art as opposed to like, all right, here's obviously the end game of I will make money off of this. Like obviously that needs to come into play in some way, but it seems like it's never been, the obviously at the forefront. You've never been the most, I guess, business savvy guy from that perspective, where it's like,
no, right. Not at all.
Right. Okay.
That was a shortcoming that has come back to haunt me.
Yeah.
In some pretty big ways. Obviously, what's happened to Hydra Head has a lot to do with that.
Of course.
But yes, the motivation for me then and now was just to work with people that I enjoyed working with, to make creative pursuits the center of my life, and to participate in a creative life that involved making connections with other people and involved, being part of a public forum, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to be connected to the world through what I was doing. I wanted to be able to have some kind of voice in the world through my art and music, and also help other people get their music out into the world. So those were always the motivations for me, and that was like the drive for me to do it. I do wish that I had spent a little more time thinking about how things could function over the long term,
right,
based off of some sound business principles. But in the same way, well, let's just put it this way. I'm glad that everything has happened the way that it has. I don't think that the label or even some of the musical projects I've been involved with would have turned out the way they have if I was thinking about business more than the creative side of things.
Right.
It probably would have been helpful for me to encounter more people along the way who did have some business sense.
That's true.
But I found myself surrounded by a lot of people who just didn't care about much of anything, or kind of like me and cared more about, making music rather than figuring out how to make a business function.
Right. How are we going to pay for this? Was ISIS your first musical endeavor from that perspective, or like had you tried to put stuff together like in high school and like?
I had some pseudo bands before I left New Mexico, but nobody that was ever really serious. I mean, we played a high school talent show.
Oh, those are always great experiences.
Yeah, I had one sort of, looking back on it, it was a pretty progressive project in a weird way. We played vacuum cleaners and ladders and tape decks and guitar. It was like a weird music concrete / industrial / metal type thing, and we only played one show, and it was opening for Coalesce and Bloodlet in Santa Fe. It was actually a lot of fun, and I wish that we had pursued that a little bit more. Anyway, I'm glad that it happened at all.
Right. Did that project have a particular name? Because it sounds like with that band would have a great name.
If it did, I don't remember what it was.
That's great.
But no, there wasn't anything really serious before I left for Boston. And then the last two, I actually can't remember when I started the band prior to ISIS, but the band was called Union Suit. And we did a demo cassette, which was an unofficial Hydra Head release, and then we did a 7-inch on Second Nature, and I think that was maybe 96 or 97. And we played quite a few local shows and out-of-state shows, and that was that. So
yeah, that got your feet wet, so to speak.
Yeah, definitely. And I knew even before doing that I really, really wanted to be in a band and do as much as possible in that way. But it wasn't really until ISIS started that I was able to do more of what I really felt like I wanted to do.
Sure, yeah, you were able to creatively express yourself more appropriately, rather than bring vacuum cleaners on stage.
Yeah, exactly. That was great, though, I have to say.
I mean, I think witnessing something like that would probably be like, the first time you see a band like, Lightning Bolt or something like that, where it's just like, what's happening?
Yeah.
Like, what is this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what this is more of a general statement, but even though you obviously fronted ISIS and a lot of attention fell directly on you because that's kind of what happens when people sing for bands, you never struck me as the person who was obviously like comfortable with that, in the sense of like, oh God, like I can't wait for all the adulation to come upon me, or all these people to ask me what my lyrics mean. Like, it always seemed like you were obviously reluctant from that perspective. Was it just kind of, you just accepted it because you knew the way it was going to be, or was it like, I wish they would talk to somebody else in the band?
I was okay with it.
Yeah.
I mean, when ISIS started, I definitely was not comfortable being a singer, and I wanted someone else to do it. And I talked about it with Jeff, our bass player, quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But it just ended up being that there wasn't another person who was right for what we wanted. So I was the de facto singer. But it took me a long time to become comfortable with that. And to some extent, I never truly became totally comfortable with it.
Right.
But as far as being sort of a spokesperson or the figurehead for the band, I was okay with it. I enjoyed, under certain circumstances, talking about the ideas behind the band. And we never wanted to go the route of, really promoting ourselves in terms of being how can I explain it? Like, we want promo pictures where our faces weren't visible, and we didn't want to really become like kind of a PR hype machine type of band.
Right.
So in a certain way, that in and of itself is image cultivation, but different sort of way.
Right.
We wanted the focus to be on the music and not so much the personalities involved. So that was kind of a very conscious decision, but it wasn't so much about being uncomfortable with that. It was just wanting the focus to be on something other than the personalities of the people involved, or something about the extracurricular activities of the people behind the band.
Right. It's like, you wanted to present it as a cohesive unit, and like not, each individual band member is building their own quote unquote brand. Like, this is just a vehicle for them to do so.
Yeah. Jeff and I, who were kind of the people who started the band, were into bands that were not mysterious necessarily, but who had a very interesting or challenging persona, in the sense that you never knew too much about the people involved, and kind of helped preserve the creative mystery around the band itself. And I think that was really, really important for us too. I was always frustrated or bummed out when I read interviews with bands that I really liked, and it was all, fart jokes or talking about getting fucked up or whatever. And stuff to me kind of took away from the band rather than adding something to it.
You want people, especially if you're creating music that obviously should be contemplative in nature, you don't want this completely juxtaposed image of like, sort of Blink 182 humor in interviews. Like, because otherwise you're just like, is this person even serious with like what they're trying to, like what they're doing? Like, what?
Yeah.
And kind of on top of that too, because like like you were saying, because there was obviously, there was an intentional air of mystery about the band. People are going to perceive you one way, as like either, elitist, hipster, whatever the hell adjective you want to put on it, I'm sure there was an element of concern from that perspective, where it's just like, oh, wow, like, Aaron is like this super, super serious dude. And like, he just doesn't have, like he has no sense of humor. Like, I'm sure people came up to you that were like, intimidated from that perspective, where it's like, oh, I can't talk to Aaron. Like, he's this enigma.
Well, there's definitely some accusations leveled at us about being pretentious and stuff like that. But
right.
As hard as it is in some way to completely remove yourself from that, unless stuff got really, really personal, we were never really bothered by it. I mean, there's a couple times where people were posting things on forums that were just so aggressive, and they were obviously from people who knew us in some way or another, or had encountered us and thought they got enough from that encounter to assume that they knew us, and that that was bothersome. But I learned to ignore it after a while. I just realized that it wasn't that important, and as soon as you enter into a public sphere and you start putting your work out into the world, there's always going to be people who want to support you, and there's going to be people who want to detract from what you're doing, and you just kind of have to let that stuff go. Otherwise, you'll drive yourself crazy.
Right. Yeah, totally. I mean, for every 10 positive things you hear about what it is that, you are creating, the one comment that you hear that could be perceived as negative or, questioning something you do, that's the one you're going to remember. Like that's just human nature.
I also learned early on from reactions I saw towards other people's music that if you were doing something that really, had some substance to it, it provoked strong reactions, and even strong negative reactions in that way are a good sign. It means you're hitting something in people on more than a surface level. That's a good thing.
No, I think it's such a great point, because there are so many things. The last thing that I think most people that create art want to be is kind of vanilla, like just like not bad, but just kind of forgettable. Like they're never going to inspire any sort of really dialogue beyond just like, oh, that was good.
Yeah. That was definitely something we wanted to avoid and consciously avoid.
Right.
And I kind of feel that way about the label too. Love or hate is better than indifference.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, and I think that's what was always the charm of what, Hiderhead did as an entity. It's like you took yourselves as a label seriously, but at the same time, like there was such a large sense of humor behind it that was like, oh, it's, like it's just a record label. Like, calm down.
Yeah.
Now that you've, been absent from the ISIS ecosystem for a while, I'm always interested to hear, if there is, a moment or two that's sort of markedly in the band's career where it was like, wow, like this stuff started to feel real. And like, maybe it's one of those things, like you said, where your parents started to be more understanding of like, oh, maybe what Aaron is doing, like there's some legitimacy behind it, like, was there any moments like that?
I can't think of any particular standout moments. There was a lot of small revelations along the way. But I don't view any one of them as being sort of the defining milestone for us. For me, just putting out our first album and being able to start touring beyond, our very small regional area was a big step. Mm-hmm. And I think everyone else felt that way too. We had big plans in the beginning, but we didn't really know if we would ever be able to follow through on those things. So when we were able to start touring, and eventually when we got overseas and to Europe for the first time, and then even a little later on got to go to Japan, all of those things were a really big deal to us. The fact that people very far away from where we had originated cared enough about our music to come and see us in their hometown was kind of a huge accomplishment. All of us have been in bands of one variety or another before being in ISIS, but none of them ever got half as far as ISIS did. So every time we'd put out another record or went to a country that we hadn't been to before, or, got to open for one of our favorite bands was a really big deal for us.
Yeah. Well, I think the mentality that you are describing is completely symptomatic of, kind of the time that ISIS existed, where like, because you came from such, modest goals where, like you said, you're like, I just want to put out a demo, and then sort of the next step where it's like, okay, I want to put out this, as opposed to, it's like, some bands, younger bands, they may have this like huge aspiration where it's like, all right, I would like to play Shea Stadium. And it's like, how do you get there? How do you even wrap your head around that? Like, why don't you have like these more reasonable steps in your life? Like, it just seems, it seems kind of, like self-defeating in nature.
Yeah. Well, I think for us, again, it was partially because we were so focused on the creative end of things. The main thing for Jeff and I when we started thinking about starting a band together was that we just hadn't really felt satisfied with the music that we had played in the other bands we were in, and just wanted to play something that was closer to what we were hearing in our heads. And so I felt okay about the first few records, but it wasn't until we made Celestial that I felt like we had partially achieved what we set out to do, in the sense that I was really excited about the whole record, and I loved the way it sounded, and I didn't wince when I was hearing anything being played back.
Right.
So that was really exciting to me. And I a lot of the moments I remember in that way was just sitting in the studio when tracks were being mixed or being recorded, and just being like, yes, this is like the song that I heard in my head, and now it exists, and it makes me feel good to hear it.
Like, yeah, it definitely is the small moments where you can take back and be like, yeah, like that's when I feel like something turned inside of me. Yeah. And so did you, like kind of like going back to your parents, and obviously the context in which, you were trying to make sure that, especially your father, where it's just like, hey Dad, like this isn't completely ruined. Like, did they ever obviously try to come see you guys, or did you ever like, kind of show them a little bit of your world that was built?
Yeah, sometimes. My mom went to quite a few of our shows, and I think she didn't know entirely what to make of it. I mean, I think the aggressive side of that music was and still is foreign to her.
Right.
And my dad saw a couple of our shows, and again, I don't think that he ever necessarily liked it, but he saw that we were really into doing it, and the fact that it made me happy, I think, was reassuring to both my parents. And I also think for them, seeing that other people were gravitating towards it and that it grew and grew over the years, probably gave them some sense that we had momentum and we had accomplished something in the more conventional sense of that term.
Because it'll be impossible to put in context, years and years of this musical stylings to them. But if you just show, it's like, oh yeah, like other people are passionate about it, and obviously, like I've got band members that are passionate about it. It's not like you just doing this thing on your own, like.
Yeah, definitely.
Two things to sort of wrap everything up. You obviously, after ISIS ended, like, I mean, you've always been prolific in all the musical stuff that you've been, doing, from, Old Man Gloom, House of Low Culture. I could obviously list millions of projects you've been involved in. You lived in Los Angeles, and then now you moved up to the Pacific Northwest. A decidedly different change from, one culture to the Pacific Northwest culture. I presume that was very deliberate in nature, where it was like, oh, okay, like let's slow this down a little bit.
To some extent, yes. Part of it just had to do with the personal circumstances of my life, and getting involved in a relationship with someone who lived in the Pacific Northwest had a lot to do with me moving there.
Right.
But I wouldn't have done it if I didn't feel like this place and this environment was going to be a very good change for me. Los Angeles was always sort of a compromise, in the sense that everybody in ISIS knew we wanted to get out of Boston before we actually left there, but nobody could agree on one place that everybody liked.
So were you legitimately having like band meetings to be like, all right, guys, what about Denver? Like, what about Chicago? Like, was it really like that? It
wasn't that broad. We all knew we could agree that we wanted to be on the West Coast. And I think had it been more affordable, we could have ended up very easily in the Bay Area, because that was one of the things that we talked about a lot, but it just wasn't economically viable.
Got it.
So LA it was.
Right.
And I got some really good things out of living there, but in a lot of ways I never got totally acclimated to it either. And I never felt like I loved LA. Like, yes, this is the place for me. There were things about it I really, really liked. But by the time, even before the time I moved away from there, I'd had enough. And having grown up somewhere rural and being surrounded by nature came back to me again. I think for a while I just wanted to get out of that. I wanted to be in a city and surrounded by people and connected to a scene and as I was when I moved to Boston.
Mm-hmm.
But, after years of being involved in music, I made all the necessary connections in the sense that I was plugged into a music network that I could be a part of in perpetuity if I chose to, no matter where I lived.
Mm-hmm.
So that combined with the drive to get out of the densely populated area and how beautiful the Pacific Northwest is was plenty of incentive for me to come up here.
Right. You're like, well, let's see, relationship, not, clean air. Like, wow, I don't know.
Yeah. There's a lot there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And sort of, like you alluded to earlier with obviously how things stand with like Hydra Head and obviously all the, tumultuous times that every record label has gone through. And obviously Hydra Head is no stranger to that. And then now, 2013 marks you obviously doing, the label will still exist and we'll put out these, and I wouldn't even call them passion projects. It's like, these cool reissues and things that obviously put in context what Hydra Head has done in the past, but obviously can sort of present it to a new audience in a way. I don't know if you'd like to elaborate with obviously your intentions for what you want to do, where you see the label sits in your life currently. Is this something that's going to take up 10% of your life, or will it take up a lot more time than you originally thought?
I don't know. Right now it's taking up a lot of time, and more time than it has in the past number of years. I would like to get it to the point where it's a lot more manageable. It is more of a side activity in a certain way. Making music is my priority. Releasing other people's music is not. That said, I feel very strongly about what Hydra Head has done. I also feel strongly about working on other people's music through Siege, the label that I do with my partner, Faith. I think those things are still very important to me, and being connected to other people that way is really important to me, and being able to preserve, to some extent at least, what Hydra Head has done over the years means a lot to me, and I think it means a lot to a lot of the people that we've been involved with over the years. So that's enough motivation for me to keep it going.
Yeah.
On a more practical level, going back to our earlier conversation, the poor business methods that Hydra had employed for years and years did come back